We will now consider log number 4964 by Ms. Mace of South Carolina. For what purposes, gentlelady from South Carolina, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please distribute the amendment without objection? The reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentlelady for the purpose of explaining her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we go from one amendment that is America last to one that is America first. Today, I offer an amendment to remove funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative because the American people are done footing the bill for endless foreign wars. The American people spoke loudly last November. They want peace. They want an end to foreign entanglements, and for their representatives to actually put their interests above those of foreign nations. To date, we spend over $170 billion in aid to Ukraine, and what do we have to show for it? A black hole where accountability should be, and a war with no end in sight. All to prop up President Zelenskyy, who cancels elections in his country while interfering in the presidential election in ours. After his failed attempt to campaign for Kamala Harris, President Zelenskyy showed up to the Oval Office, and instead of showing gratitude to the American people, he acted like an insolent child toward President Trump. It's time we stop asking the American people to carry the burden of this war. It's simply not in our interest to do so. For decades, this body has operated under the delusion that we can police the entire world, topple unfriendly regimes without consequences, and turn every nation in the world into a liberal Western democracy. There's been an utter lack of thought for the one thing which matters most. How does American involvement make life better for the American citizens we represent? This amendment is not about choosing sides. It's about choosing responsibility to the American taxpayer and putting the American people first. Our national debt is over $37 trillion and counting, and our nation teeters on fiscal catastrophe. Every time Congress approves more aid, we put more debt on the backs of American taxpayers. We have real problems in this country. Walk outside this building and across our nation's capital, and you'll see it. Visit California, where the liberals are literally burning cities to the ground, Antifa and illegals. Just blocks away from where we sit, it's not funny watching cities burn under Gavin Newsom. We see American citizens being gunned down in broad daylight, homeless veterans sleeping on our streets, crumbling infrastructure, and open-air drug use. Every dollar sent to Ukraine is a dollar stolen from the American people. Congress has continuously signed off on war on behalf of a country most people can't find on a map. No one can coherently explain why it's in our national interest to do this. No one can tell us what victory looks like. No one can tell us what the end game is, and no one can explain our exit strategy or even if we have one. And no one can tell us how much additional American treasure we will have to spill in Ukraine. For years, while NATO pushed eastward despite Russia's repeated warnings, our NATO allies underinvested in their own defenses and counted on the American people to bail them out. Americans don't want another forever war. Americans don't want to keep paying for Zelenskyy's photo ops, and they sure as hell don't want their sons and daughters to die in the Donbass. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from, Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I spoke why we should support Ukraine to some detail, but just a couple things. I mean, just voted to increase the debt by nearly $4 trillion. I mean, I just don't think you should be able to talk about the debt after you take a vote like that. Second of all, yes, I agree. The American people do not want the United States of America to send our troops to fight in wars. I think we've learned some really strong lessons about what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there are no American troops fighting in Ukraine. We want to prevent that from happening by keeping peace and stability in the world so that it doesn't tumble into that direction. So to use the wars where we did send American troops, and in many cases mistakenly, as an excuse for not stopping what Putin is doing in Eastern Europe completely misses the point. And we are not trying to create a liberal democracy. Ukraine was a free democracy before Putin invaded in an attempt to destroy it. In a relatively low-cost way, we are keeping peace and stability in a part of the world that could easily turn in the other direction. This is an excellent investment in that. And the end game, as I said in the first point, is to stop Putin so he's forced to the table. As has been outlined, there is no evidence that he's going to stop in the Donbass or at Kyiv or in Moldova or elsewhere. You know, Secretary Hegseth, before he was secretary, had a memorable way of putting it, saying, well, you know, in Ukraine, Putin just wants his stuff back. And what he meant by that, of course, was the Soviet Empire that Putin has, waxed nostalgic as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, that it collapsed. Yeah, Mr. Secretary, you're right. He wants his stuff back. But there's a lot of stuff he wants. And if he's not stopped here, the conflict grows. And furthermore, if the message is sent that you can simply take territory if you have the military muscle to do it, that is a lesson that China will take, one way or the other. If this proves to be a disaster for Putin, a mistake that costs Russia more than it gains, China will learn that lesson. If we in the 53-nation coalition, it's not just us, it's 53 nations in this coalition. If we step back and let Putin take Ukraine and God knows what else, China will heed that message as well. That is why this is in our interests and why I urge opposition to this amendment.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I echo the ranking member's comments here as well. Now, we learned in the 1930s that saying, hey, what's going on over in Europe or what's going on in Asia, it doesn't affect us. We learned it didn't work. Isolationism did not work in the 1930s. The GOP was last isolationist in the 1930s, and we realized it didn't work. And we've, ever since World War II, have been advocates for peace through strength and having a strong alliance system and standing up to the bully. And when we talk about endless wars, we don't have any troops there. It's Ukraine that's trying to defend themselves against a barbaric invasion, against bombings every night in their cities. They just need our military help so they can win this war. And I echo the comments too, it's going to cost us more if Russia prevails. I'm telling you, Moldova will be next, and they'll put them right on the border of NATO. The Baltics could very well be next. Georgia is already being invaded by Russia at a smaller scale, but still the invasion's going on. And Azerbaijan is under threat right now as we speak. And I think Americans voted for President Trump this last cycle because of the border and because of inflation. Yet, every poll I see, it's typically around 2-1 in favor of Ukraine. So the Americans did not vote for that. They voted for other reasons for President Trump. And I am grateful that President Trump is seeing through Putin right now and pivoting on this strategy with Ukraine and now committing weapons to go to Ukraine, and I hope a lot more as we go along. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this amendment. It's short-sighted. It goes against America's most fundamental values and would cripple our security interests in Europe. My colleague on the other side of the aisle is fond of saying she's putting America's interests first, but eliminating the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative is the complete opposite of putting America's interests first. There's no better investment in America's national security than our support for Ukraine. Russia is one of America's foremost adversaries in the world, and Vladimir Putin is hell-bent on destroying America's global leadership. Since he first became president, he has pushed a violent and ceaseless campaign to restore Russia to its Soviet-era strength. He has invaded Russia's neighbors, including Ukraine, multiple times, assassinated political enemies, and committed blatant acts of sabotage and terrorism in Europe and across the world. Vladimir Putin is America's enemy, and anyone who says differently is delusional. When Putin began his brutal invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, he thought he would achieve victory in a matter of days. But he severely underestimated the courage, tenacity, and ingenuity of the Ukrainian people who have fought and died every day since that invasion to defend their country. So now hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed, thousands of tanks and vehicles have been destroyed, hundreds of aircraft and helicopters have been shot down, and some of Russia's most formidable warships have been sunk. Every Russian tank that Ukrainians destroy on the battlefield, every missile they shoot out of the sky, every nuclear bomber they blow up on an airfield is one less that we have to worry about. And it is one less that the U.S. would have to destroy if we ever ended up at war with Russia. Ukraine is fighting our adversary and destroying its military. Even Trump agrees and seems to be starting to understand the threat that Putin poses. In just the last few days, he's expressed support for sending significant military aid to Ukraine. How is pulling U.S. assistance from Ukraine and strengthening Russia putting America's interests first? Moreover, the majority of U.S. money for Ukraine is spent right here in the United States purchasing munitions and equipment from American companies. This spending supports thousands of good-paying jobs in places like New Jersey and South Carolina. Supporting Ukraine doesn't mean we are supporting some far-off war that doesn't impact us. Supporting Ukraine means helping them defeat our adversaries and supporting American workers. That's putting America's interests first, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief on this, but I want this war to end. And if we want this war to end, there are two things that have to happen. One is we have to make sure that Ukrainians can defend themselves, and we have to make sure that Ukrainians can deliver offensive punches, not just defensive punches. Now, the mistakes that have been made in the past, Biden wouldn't allow the Ukrainians to play offense. We did not enforce the sanctions against countries that were buying oil from Russia that allowed Vladimir Putin to prop up his economy. And if we're honest, Europe, their banks continue to do business in Russia, and Europe, the European Union and Greece sold almost 100 ships to Russia for the Russians to carry out their fleet so that they could sell their oil. So there's a lot of people in the world that are responsible for this Ukrainian war continuing at this stage. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters because of democracy, but I would respectfully submit it also matters because of the global food supply. Odessa's port is probably the largest port from the standpoint of gross tonnage of food deliveries to the world and the global food supply. And the reason Putin wants to control the Black Sea is because it gives him control over a significant portion of the food supply of the world, and that gives him control over a lot of economies, and he's got to be stopped. So I want the war to end. I think the best way for the war to end is for us to enforce the sanctions against Russia, and new sanctions too. But we got to give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to defend themselves until the sanctions are strong enough to cripple Russia's economy and Putin goes back into his own territory and takes care of Russians instead of picking on Ukrainians. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bendeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The gentlelady's amendment and comments in favor of this amendment are frankly nonsensical, short-sighted, and filled with misinformation, in fact, Russian misinformation, and FSB talking points. Supporting Ukraine is in U.S. national security interest, and it's not just the values side of this argument, that freedom and democracy, the things that this country fought a revolution to achieve, but it's also in our real tangible national security interests now, and standing against a autocratic axis that is obviously, very obviously forming with Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. China is watching what we do in Ukraine. They're watching to see whether we abandon our allies in NATO, our partners in Ukraine that we've committed to supporting. We convinced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons in the 90s. They were the third biggest nuclear power in the world. We convinced them to give up those weapons. We made a commitment, whether you want to call it a soft commitment or otherwise. China is watching to see whether we back away from our commitments, and they will act accordingly in Taiwan. Further, the winds are obviously changing, and this amendment is contrary to the direction that this administration is heading in. The lady is on the wrong side. The gentlelady is on the wrong side. The war in Ukraine has provided untold benefits to the national security of this country, taking out some of the strategic bombers, taking out thousands of armored vehicles that were poised against us in Eastern Europe. And frankly, it's created space in places like Syria, where the Russians were too distracted in Ukraine to be able to reinforce Bashar al-Assad, and the same thing in Iran. The benefits are very obvious to me, and I think the gentlelady is wrong on this amendment. and I urge voting against it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sorensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose Congresswoman Mace's short-sighted amendment to cut funding for the Ukraine Security Initiative. When Americans speak, people around the world listen. When America stands by its allies stand by us. When we abandon our allies, the rest of the world wonders if we will abandon them. Letting Vladimir Putin win isn't just bad for Ukraine, it's bad for us. Within the past few weeks, the city of Brovary experienced horrific shelling and a major drone attack at the hands of Russia. Brovary, Ukraine is the sister city of my hometown of Rockford, Illinois. Both cities have a place in my heart. The inconsistent messages from the White House are an embarrassment. The rest of the world is looking at us and either laughing or crying. While I'm glad our already congressionally appropriated military aid will be making its way to Ukraine, it should never be in question. I'm thankful that President Trump is finally beginning to understand who Putin really is. He's a man who says one thing and does something else. A dangerous autocrat who is hell-bent on doing anything he can to resurrect the Soviet Union. As Americans, we must remain unified. And the only thing the Congresswoman's amendment would do is make us weaker in the eyes of our adversaries. I urge my colleagues to be on the right side of this vote and on the right side of history. Vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment because I support the cessation of feeding this war. There's been zero intelligent definition of what victory would look like over there. You think Crimea is going back to Ukraine? You think they're getting back their eastern territories? You fed them. I've been on the ground over there. I have in my heart love for the Ukrainian people and their stance for their own sovereignty and their freedom. I know what that feels like. And you have fed them enough weaponry for their entire nation to be pounded into dust. And who's going to rebuild? If you could define victory, if anyone in this body could define victory out of some fantastic imagination that Ukraine is going to defeat Russia and get back what? Pre-2014 lines? It's insanity. And if that would happen, funded by the American people with borrowed money that we don't have, we're currently $37 trillion in debt. And the ranking member says that we voted to raise the debt. He knows that's not true. He knows that's not true. We raised the debt limit and decreased spending. And I think $37 trillion is not humorous. Good sir. If this body were to run a $1 billion surplus, it would require 37,000 years to address a $37 trillion debt. And that is not funny. So the American people are indeed watching very carefully. Should we continue to spend borrowed treasure on a war that this body is unable to define victory? I support the good lady's amendment, and I take offense to the way she's been referenced here. She certainly put her heart and her mind and her intentions into what she believes is best for the American people. And I understand where she's coming from. I support the President's diplomatic endeavor, including using the threat of enhanced military actions. But watch what he does. President Trump is 10, 20 steps ahead of everybody in the room. And he knows that the end to this war is the only way to define victory. I support the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Well, sir, you certainly riled me up, but I'm going to let Mr. Smith have a go at you. I yield my time to Mr. Smith.
I'm not going to have a go at anybody, but thank you very much. And just 3 quick points. One, to the extent that anyone was disrespectful to Ms. Mace, I certainly didn't hear it. I mean, I appreciate this, and we have a difference of opinion, and we express that difference of opinion. I don't think anyone said anything disrespectful. Second of all, I'm sorry, but you didn't just vote to increase the debt. That's a hard one to swallow. I apologize for laughing, but every single person who's analyzed it, even your own side, agrees that you increase the debt. The disagreement is by how much. So that one really threw me. But third, I will tell you what the definition of victory is. It is what the Biden administration said from time to time and then really struggled to stick to the message. I will grant you that. A sovereign, democratic Ukraine that can defend itself and we don't wind up with a war against Russia. That is the definition of success. We are not insisting upon a particular set of borders. We are insisting that Putin stops his attempt to destroy Ukraine, that there is a sovereign, democratic Ukraine when this is done. It will not be perfect, to be sure, but to give up and let Putin destroy Ukraine, the goal is to stop that. Now, I'll grant you, not everyone has been as clear as they should have been on that, but that has been the approach from the very start. A sovereign, democratic Ukraine, the survival of Ukraine. That, I think, is achievable, and that's what we should help them achieve. I yield back. Thank you.
Oh, my, Mr. Smith, you left me with 1 minute, 10 seconds.
What's wrong with brevity?
Exactly right. You just heard a definition of success from Mr. Smith. I'll give you a definition of defeat. Ukraine is overrun by Russia. Ukraine becomes a satellite of Russia or is absorbed into Russia. And then the next step is what Putin has said repeatedly for the last 25 years, and that is the reestablishment of the old Soviet Union, including the Warsaw Pact. So all of the Eastern European countries are at risk. The definition of defeat is Russia taking over, dominating in one or another way Ukraine. Step one. Step two has been alluded to by our colleagues here. That's the definition of defeat. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I strongly oppose Representative Mace's amendment. It is absolutely insane to stop funding for Ukraine's security initiative at this point in time. I would encourage us, I would beg us to remember our history. Dare I say, or ask people to do the research and understand that it is 1939 again here in this world. This is my father's teddy bear. It is a sawdust teddy bear that he brought over from Poland when he survived the Holocaust and World War II with his mom. He was born in what is now Ukraine, what it was Poland at the time in 1942, just days into and days away from Hitler's final solution. We know how this conflict will end because Putin has told us how it's going to end. We know where this is going because he has told us where this is going, to Georgia, to the Baltics, to Azerbaijan, and indeed to Lithuania, where Pennsylvania's partner nation in Lithuania's soldiers are sitting right now as we speak. And then it's going, possibly, to Xi, because he's watching too, because they are watching too. The investment that we Americans are putting into this is pennies on the dollar in terms of what we get in return. These brave Ukrainian men and women who have fought for years on our behalves and put their lives on the line for us, for the democracies around the world, deserve our continued support. And I'm grateful that President Trump has finally, seemingly seen the reality and the importance of support of Ukraine. I agree that this amendment is misplaced. It is an artifact of time and history, and it should be dismissed without regard. We must support Ukraine. Past is absolutely prologue, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Vasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may have missed something, Mr. Chair, and I want to make sure this doesn't go unaddressed. But what exactly do the California ice raids have anything to do with the Ukraine Security Initiative? We have got to stop scapegoating immigrants for every issue on the other side, because this has absolutely nothing to do with this subject matter. We should be treating this committee with the respect that it deserves and staying on top of it and talking about Ukraine and our national interest in the Baltic. And I respect the other side when they make coherent and logical arguments as to why we should be pulling out. Those are good discussions for us to have here. But I don't believe the Ukraine Security Initiative has anything to do with California ice raids, unless I'm mistaken, unless there's some secret Ukraine cartel organization that's smuggling Central Americans into California. If that's the case, then I will retract my comments. But as far as I know, using immigrants to scapegoat an issue about the Ukraine Security Initiative, give me a break. This has nothing to do with immigrants. I urge my colleagues to strongly oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleague talked about how likely is it to for Ukraine to defeat Russia. And I would just say, let's just go back and look at history. There was this, I read about this small colony that took on the baddest, biggest superpower the world had ever seen and won its independence. And so I would remind this body to not forget who we are. We are the legacy of democracy. And democracy is hard. It's tough. When it takes root, we have to support it, as we said before. But let's not forget who we are. And our sworn enemy, we get an opportunity to take on our sworn enemy without using any of our troops. There's a disconnect here. I don't understand what the issue is here when we're talking about a democracy that is fighting for its sovereignty that aligns with our very same principles. And so I think we just need to remember who we are. I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Vindman.
Thank you. Thank you. So now that we're talking about history, a favorite topic of mine, let us also remember when this nation was born, we defeated the greatest power, land power, and sea power on the planet. But we did that also with the help of the French. And maybe we ought to remember that when we consider whether we want to support or revoke our support from the Russians. Let me recommend to my colleague also that on the other side of the aisle that the values that you recognize in the Ukrainians, seeking freedom, democracy, this is a new democracy, only 34 years old or so. Why not let those be your guidepost on what the right action here is? It's consistent with our national security. We already talked about that. But let's also be guided by our values. Let's talk a little bit of facts. Ukraine is not being pounded into dust. Ukrainian cities are taking heavy fire, undoubtedly, but there's no imminent threat of a collapse. Ukraine is now a major UAV power. We saw that in Operation Spiderweb. We see that in the pace of Russian advance on the front line. We may be the preferred partner, but we're not the only partner. The Europeans will step in. NATO will step in. I guarantee the Polish have no interest in having Russia on their doorstep. Finally, how do we get to peace? We need negotiations. We get to negotiations only by putting pressure on Russia. That is the direction that we have to move in. That is the direction the president is moving in. And that's why I'm against this amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, I don't. Okay, Mr. Keating's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The number 30 to 27 is going to be something we'll remember tomorrow morning or whenever we get through with this, because the votes will always be 30 to 27, with rare exceptions in this. So in one sense, I'm glad this amendment's placed in. I'm against it. The concept behind it is dead wrong. We're going to have an opportunity in this committee, and I hope I'm not wrong, where you're not going to see a 30 to 27 vote against this. You're going to see a bipartisan vote against this, because there's bipartisan consensus in Congress that we're concerned about honoring nuclear proliferation agreements that date back to the Budapest Agreement here, something that's important as we negotiate other agreements. We're at least sticking to our words so far, not as well as I'd like, but certainly not the way Russia has betrayed that. There's a bipartisan concern about China and the threat of China. And everyone in this committee knows our #1 policy is deterrence. And the #1 example of not being deterrent power is collapsing our coalition around our support of Ukraine. There's a bipartisan concern about funding, too, and the money. And I think particularly longstanding members of this committee will know that in the absence of Ukraine winning and Putin's just overt attacks and threats to the Baltics, we're going to deploy more troops in Eastern Europe if Ukraine loses, and that'll cost a multiple amount more than the small amount we're investing here. And there's also a bipartisan concern on how we're going to pay it on the Repo Act and using the Russian frozen assets, potentially, to rebuild and to help Ukraine the way that we should, make the person that's responsible. And in Europe, that's over $300 billion that's there, much smaller here. So I look at this vote coming up later on this amendment, and I hopefully will see a break from about every other vote that we're going to have. And that will be a great message to send to Putin. That'll be a great message to send to people in the country who don't really know or are confused by some of our support here, by looking at the #1 committee in Congress that's given the responsibility of making those decisions for the American people and seeing a bipartisan vote against this. So I look forward to that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member seek to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Chairman. I, too, am going to encourage us to vote against this amendment. And speaking out against an amendment is not a personal attack on the person who brought it forward. This is about our responsibility as the United States of America to protect freedom and democracy. And our adversaries right now are watching this, filled with glee that this nation looks divided right now. That President Zelenskyy first came to visit the House chambers in a bipartisan manner and got multiple standing ovations across the board. And as time has gone on, that support seems to be waning from one side of the aisle. No one wants a war to go on forever. But Vladimir Putin cannot be successful. He must be brought to the negotiating table to do something that is fair, that allows Ukraine to remain a sovereign nation and a democracy. So if we want to put America first, we will support Ukraine. If we want to put America first, we're not going to take health care away from 7 million people or food out of the mouths of hungry children to give tax breaks to billionaires and jack up the debt to $4 trillion. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to speak on the Mace amendment? There's no further debate. The question occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Mace. So many as in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. All right. The amendment's not agreed to.